Hi there. Today we'll be talking about the 1920s and 1930s, and then we'll turn our attention to the stuff that took place right before the 1920s, the First World War. That will be sort of an odd tag-along to the decades that followed it. As we'll see, historians' debates about the two later decades help define their ideas about World War I, too. So now that we're here, let me just say, welcome to the modern age. All history can be relevant to the present day, of course, and historians' arguments over all the time periods we've discussed so far reflect their ideas about their own time. But their debates about the 1920s, and especially the 1930s, more so than their discussions of, say, the Progressive Era or even the Civil War, feel extremely current. Indeed, America hasn't had an economic downturn or seen its government respond to that downturn since then that didn't cause its policymakers and the general public to debate in the most serious terms the causes of the Great Depression or the way that the government responded to it. When people argue about Franklin Roosevelt or Herbert Hoover, they tend to be arguing about, well, pick your liberal or conservative politician of today. What this means is that historians' debates about these decades frequently come down to something I sort of disapprove of, which is the question of which thing was good and which thing was bad. My own feeling is that we can do better, examining what various responses to the Depression reveal about what life and America and its people's mindsets were like at the time. But the more utilitarian strains are the biggies, and it's important to recognize that when historians say things about this period, they're also saying things about their own time, and that their opinions about their own time will probably affect their analysis of the past. So let's break this down into three realms of inquiry, realms with which you're already expecting by now: politics, economics, and society. In politics, historians' ideas about these decades tend to fit into two slots. The first says that the politics of the 1920s, perhaps responding to the perceived excesses of the Progressive Era and of America's entry into World War I, pushed for America's government to retrench, to cut down on regulation and bureaucracy, and to pull back from involvement in the world. Depending on the historian's perspective, this either led to spectacular business growth or to the rampant inequality that paved the way for the Great Depression to start. Once Franklin Delano Roosevelt came into office, this view holds, things swung the other way, into massive government growth and involvement in the affairs of other countries that led to World War II and to the United Nations. If this is the case, by the way, I'd like you to consider what factors encouraged American voters to allow for such unprecedented government expansion, so contrary, apparently, to the desires of previous generations of Americans. Were voters duped by the Depression's severity into giving up their principles, or did they see this change as the only reasonable response to such a massive crisis? And again, depending on the historian, this change either set the country down the path to a managed economy, even, for some fringe historians, down the path to socialism, or it brought Americans' politics to a more evolved version of the reforming spirit of the Progressive Era, creating modern-day liberalism. The flip side of this view is the argument that both the policies of Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover in the 1920s and the New Deal of Roosevelt in the 1930s essentially continued and expanded on the politics of earlier eras, in particular the Progressive Era. Historians who hold to this view argue that the government in the 1920s wasn't as laissez-faire, that is, it didn't leave people so much alone, as its reputation holds, and that politicians like Hoover especially were involved in expanding government in targeted and essentially progressive ways. What is more, America kept up its long-standing tradition of intervening in foreign affairs, especially in Latin America. This meant that the government programs of the New Deal, and even the build-up to World War II, were less radical than they are sometimes described as being. The scholars who've made this argument about continuity or perhaps more moderate change have either, from one end of the political spectrum, defended conservatism as a sophisticated and progressive ideology, or, from the other end of the spectrum, sighed at Roosevelt's failure, especially in the first 4 years of his administration, to propose more radical changes. I'd ask you to think about how much any of this tells us. How conservative were the politics of the 1920s, and how radical the politics of the 1930s, and why? Whatever your answers, think think about what they reveal about America, what it was before, and what it became. In terms of economics, the fights are related and, again, still relevant. The enduring questions can be boiled down to two. Why did the Great Depression start? Or, once it started, why did it get so bad? And why did it end? If you followed the debates about government, you can get the debates about society, too. Some historians argue that specific economic changes in the 1920s led to the Great Depression. I'd have you think about what sorts of changes these might have been. Others argue that the Depression was merely a symptom of the wider disease that is capitalism, and we have enough experience of capitalism's benefits and dangers already this semester to think hard about whether what we see in the Great Depression is something that diverges from that standard or merely continues it. As for the Depression's end, you can see the political implications even more clearly. Scholars, economists as much as historians, continue to debate whether the Depression ended or was even significantly mitigated because of the success of Roosevelt's New Deal government programs, or because of the increase in spending eventually occasioned by World War II, or because of capitalism's highly debatable tendency to self-correct after a downturn. Certainly, each interpretation here carries with it significant implications for a historian's ideas about capitalism and about government. Given our limited source base this semester, I do not really expect that you'll be able to answer either of these questions definitively, but I do hope you'll pay attention to the ways that people who lived through the period answered them themselves, and how their answers suggest both their ideas about America and their experience of the 2 decades. The continuity versus change debate that marked the previous 2 categories also mark our understanding of society in these decades. Historians are still divided over the social impact of the 1920s and 1930s. Some have seen in the 1920s a time of great social change marked by unprecedented prosperity, a general lifting of the economic tide that supposedly marked a descent into individualist frivolity. They, or others, noted that the struggles of the 1930s sent some Americans back, when the Depression hit, into a more communalist and even radical ethos, as evidenced by the upsurge in unionization that took place in that decade. Other historians, finally, have noted that the 1920s may have cemented a long evolving change in American society, the growth of consumerism, in which consumer products like cars and iPhones stopped merely addressing Americans' needs and started defining their identities. You may have occasion to ask whether this was actually new, or whether it was irreversible. Did even a catastrophe like the Great Depression set it back? You might also ask, if consumerism was real, what impact would it have had, if any, on America's economy and politics? So we return at the end of all of this to the First World War. Historians struggle to say whether the 1920s and 1930s marked a decisive change or a long-term continuity in American life, and that debate affects how they perceive World War I. Specifically, historians have asked if the war, which was so definitive for Europe, mattered much in America at all. Or were its events wrapped up either in the long strands of history already unraveling, or dwarfed by the massive changes about to take place? In terms of the political story, you can see how World War I might have fit the patterns from the 1920s and 1930s. It saw America's government growing in interesting ways and intervening on the national stage. But you'll also notice the debates about what America should be and how it should act. Not everyone was on board with this stuff, with many people thinking that their government should do less, not more, especially overseas. The economic narrative might apply to World War I too. Perhaps World War I was all part of the long drive to gain access to world markets that we saw in the Gilded Age and in America's first imperialist adventures, the difference here being that instead of batting away the new upstart, Europe's established industrial powers were busy destroying each other, leaving room for America to assert itself, and leaving Europe coming begging to America for help, as you can see in this cartoon. Finally, World War II might fit into the cultural narratives of the later decades too. You might perceive how the war could change family life, but still instill a desire for traditional values, how it could encourage radical ideas about class, race, and gender, but simultaneously nurture conservatism. There is always room here for a counter-narrative, for finding ideas hidden under rocks. What do you find? And what does it tell us about America as its people embarked upon two of its most tumultuous decades?